have questions.
Great. Awesome. Well, yeah, first of all, yeah, thanks so much for the invite to be here. Really, really appreciate it. And it's been a really fun conference so far. Really enjoyed myself. So what I'm going to be presenting today is some material from this book that I've been working on for like way too long, and I'm actually finally trying to finish right now. The book is like my grand vision of the metaphysics and epistemology of consciousness. And when I first started writing this book, I had some, I had some ideas about the hard problem and other supposed sort of epistemic barriers to like a full explanatory theory of consciousness. I wanted to write a book that was sort of, as a result, setting aside those sort of traditional worries and focusing on what I thought were some more neglected problems. But I've been working on this book for years now, and the more time has passed, the more it's become the case that some classic problems like the hard problem and so on have actually taken more center stage in my book, despite my best intentions. And what I'm going to be talking about, and the first chapter of my book involves my take on the hard problem. And some of the later chapters kind of develop that take on the hard problem, which is a somewhat deflationary take. So I sort of think that there isn't really a hard problem, at least in the sense that it's been traditionally theorized by people like Frank Jackson, Dave Chalmers, and so on. And part of my thinking here has to do with the debate about illusionism. So as I'll explain in a second, I think that one can basically satisfactorily dissolve the hard problem, at least what I think is the real hard problem, by explaining why certain intuitions about experience, for example, in the intuition that it's qualitative in some special way, or the intuition that it has some special kind of intrinsic nature that cannot be explained in structural terms, those types of intuitions. If we can explain why those intuitions are debunkable and don't need to be trusted, then that's enough to solve the hard problem. So that's the sort of the big narrative in which this talk fits. But I'm not going to have time to actually unpack all the material from earlier in my book. This is like chapter 7 of my book that I'm going to be presenting today. But I'm just giving you this preamble to sort of explain that this fits into a larger narrative. So here's the sort of structure of how I'm thinking about this. And this is actually just the structure of the chapter from my book that this is taken from. And some of these sections I'm not even going to do today because I don't think I'm going to have time. But I'm going to start by saying a little bit more about how I'm seeing the connections between the debate about illusionism and the debate about the hard problem. I'm going to define this view I call banal realism. It's my take on how to think about things. And then there's going to be two sections of the talk that are like the main dish that I'm definitely going to try to get to within the time. One is basically a framework for thinking about debunking arguments. So this whole idea that we need to apply debunking arguments to the belief that experience has certain special inexplicable features has led me to want to think more carefully about different types of debunking arguments and the force that they have. And I've come up with my own framework for sort of taxonomizing them and thinking about how they function. So that's the part that I want to present today. And then secondly, I also have a taxonomy of different ways in which a defender of an inflationary intuition about consciousness could respond. So I'm going to go over that taxonomy and explain why I'm rather skeptical about all the different options that one could take. So that's the second part of the main dish. And then the last part, part 6, I'm going to skip over part 4 and 5, which I'm just putting on this slide so that you know that I have some things to say about those things. So if you want to ask me about them, you can. I'm not going to actually talk about them in the talk. Part 6, I'm going to get into the debate about strong illusionism. So one new thing in my thinking about this is that I've become a bit more sympathetic to taking a version of strong illusionism seriously. That's the view that consciousness doesn't exist. So I think there's a way of understanding that claim where it's not as crazy. It's not as crazy a view as it might initially seem. And I think playing that view through my whole framework for thinking about debunking arguments leads maybe to some interesting new ways of thinking about strong illusionism debate, and also relatedly the idea of a Morean truth experience. Okay. So that's what's on the menu for today. So first of all, I just want to say a little bit about my take on the hard problem. To really defend this properly would be a whole other talk, but I'm going to at least tell you a little bit about how I'm thinking about this. So there's a standard view of it, which is that there's this explanatory puzzle that is that comes from the alleged fact that there is no a priori derivability of phenomenal facts from physical facts. So according to this way of thinking, once you know all the physical facts, you can still wonder, well, why is it that there's this particular configuration of phenomenology? Why am I having red experience rather than green experience and so on? So that's that familiar idea. But according to me, the mere existence of this lack of a priori derivability both doesn't explain why we have hard problem intuitions, really. And that's because I think you can come up with examples where you've got that same kind of gappiness and we just don't have a hard problem type intuition. And neither do I think that it's really a compelling explanatory problem. I'm not going to get into that today, but that's my view. So I think a little bit that we've been led up the garden path by the sort of Chalmers-Jackson way of characterizing the hard problem. And I think a better way of thinking of it is that we've got these intuitions about experience that lead us, or lead some people to believe that it has what I call alien features. That is, properties whose very nature precludes them from having an explanation in the form of a materialist reduction. Or at least I should say, my way of thinking about the underlying metaphysics commits me to thinking that if you're a materialist, you should be a reductive materialist and give like a strongly reductive explanation. If you're a so-called non-reductive materialist, then your views will play through what I'm going to say today in a slightly different way. But I'm just going to preface this by saying that when I talk about materialism, I'm typically thinking in a strongly reductive way about materialism. I can say a bit more about that in Q&A. So what would be some examples of alien features like this? One example that I'm quite interested in is the case of people who think that experience has a special kind of primitive intentionality. If you think that red experiences involve some special way of sensorially entertaining a primitive property of redness, then you've kind of built it into your account that that cannot be given a reductive materialist metaphysical explanation. And similarly, for the way that some people understand terms like qualitative or subjective, or claims to the effect that there's something especially sort of intrinsic about the qualitative character of experience. And there are other ones too, and at least later slide I've got a more comprehensive list. So I think we should think of the hard problem as more like someone giving a Leibniz's law argument against materialist reduction. So if experience has, say, the special kind of intentionality, then that just means that it cannot be identical with, say, a complex neurofunctional state, because neurofunctional states don't involve, direct awareness of primitive redness. So it's not just that you can't derive that from physical description. It's that the very nature of acquaintance with primitive redness excludes materialist reduction. And therefore, that's why there's this sense that we can't explain consciousness. And also, that would be a compelling kind of explanatory problem. Okay, so that's how I'm thinking about what the hard problem really should be taken to be. Now, just a comment about how I'm going to be talking about this for the rest of the talk. Mostly just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to now imagine that we're talking about a debate between a dualist who is fully embracing these intuitions that experience has alien features, and a materialist who wants to reject the idea that these alien features exist and debunk those intuitions. But to give a more complete story, we would want to deal with the so-called Russellian monists and panpsychists and so on, who might also base their anti-materialist views on inflationary intuitions about consciousness. But I'll never get anywhere near the end of this talk if I try to talk about that separately every time it comes up. So I'm just going to talk about it as if it's just materialism and dualism. I'll also sometimes talk about what I call alien descriptors. They are terminology we use to describe experience that does not appear in an objective scientific description of underlying physical processes. So it's things like saying that your experience is of a red thing. And these are descriptions which maybe not be derivable a priori from the physical description, and which at least some people will interpret in terms of alien features. So if you particularly take on the intentionality of experience that excludes material reduction, an example of an inflationary read on intentional talk. Okay. But the mere existence of these alien descriptors does not in itself create a hard problem. Because one way of dealing with them is a kind of deflationary way. So if you're a materialist, you can say, yeah, we talk this way about experience, but that doesn't really commit us to this alien metaphysics. We can just give a semantics of, say, talk about the intentional character of experience entirely in terms of internal functional role and what we track in the environment and so on and so forth, in a way that basically deflates it. So what I'm interested in are people who are not giving that kind of deflationary materialist read on alien descriptors, but instead want to read in some serious metaphysics there. And I think the way to dissolve the hard problem is to debunk that kind of inflationary read. Now, that raises the question, what do you mean by a debunking argument? What would it be to debunk belief in alien features? And that's what I want to get into in a little bit more detail. But before I get to that, I want to just talk a little bit about how this dialectic tends to play out. So I'm picturing someone who wants to defend the idea that there's this really serious explanatory problem, hard problem, and also who maybe wants to push in the direction of dualism, someone like Dave Chalmers. And I think they might legitimately say the following two things. First of all, they might say, look, it's not actually very interesting or surprising, especially if we accept causal closure, to observe that hard problem intuitions can be given complete materialist explanations. So if all you mean by debunk is give a materialist explanation, then so what? That's not particularly disturbing. And then they'll also come along and say, look, the cost of this materialist approach is an implausible illusionism. If you're denying that experience has all these special features, then that is just tantamount to saying that there's this grand kind of illusion going on. Either that consciousness doesn't exist or it's radically different from how it strikes us. And that's a cost that's too much to bear. And so therefore we should go dualist instead, despite the possibility of this kind of debunking argument. And I actually I'm somewhat sympathetic, at least with the first part of this. But here's what I'm imagining the materialists should say in response to that. It's not just that hard problem intuitions can be explained in materialist terms. Maybe everyone can agree with that. It's that believers in alien features can't even explain on their own terms how they know that experience has those features. So, for example, suppose you claim that experience has a special kind of intentionality that cannot be productively explained in materialist terms. And you say that the reason why, you say that the way in which you know that is through direct introspection. Then on my way of thinking, you then owe us a story of how it's possible to directly introspect that experience has that special kind of metaphysics. And what I'm skeptical of is whether the anti-materialists really can give an acceptable story about how they can have that kind of knowledge of the metaphysics of experience. So we'll talk more about that. That's kind of like main theme of this talk. So that's one thing the materialists can say that I'm going to dig into in more detail. And then secondly, in response to the claim that there's a kind of implausible illusionism lurking in the materialist view, what I think they should say is that that's not really true. Rather, the way we should think about materialism is that it's kind of epistemically and metaphysically modest. That it's not committing to experience having special features, but that doesn't mean there's a kind of grand illusion. It just means that we're understanding those features in a modest way where it's more intelligible that we can know about them in the first place. So that leads to this view that I call banal realism. Basically, the banal realist says something like this, that ordinary thought and talk about experience are in perfectly good shape. So if I say things like, I'm seeing this chair, and I can see that it's the color blue, that's fine. What goes wrong is when people claim to have phenomenal intuitions with more loaded metaphysics in them. So, if you say something like, I can just tell from introspection that I'm having an experience that involves a special mental relation to the property of yellowness, revealing to me the primitive and irreducible qualitative character of yellowness, then the banal realist says, get out of here. There's no way in which something like introspection could deliver anything that is that metaphysically rich. All we can get from introspection is just really quite boring things like, I'm seeing a blue object. And they think, I think, what often goes wrong in discussions of consciousness is that people are taking as sort of initial data on the basis of introspection metaphysical claims of a kind that never could be delivered by something like introspection. The banal realist sees no shame in just rejecting those types of claims, and that doesn't give us an implausible illusionism. That just gives us a nice modest realism. Okay. So I just want to say, a little bit more about the kinds of intuitions that I have in mind that I think generate the whole problem, and which I'm going to talk about. Hopefully, if I have time later, I'll say a little bit about just the very existence of experience and why I think that should be counted as an inflationary intuition that invites debunking. Another one is just dualist intuitions straight up, which some people have. Another kind of intuition involves terms like qualitative or subjective. So sometimes people claim that the way that we ordinarily describe the world, the physical world, kind of precludes relations like temporal and spatial relations and causal relations being qualitative or subjective in a sense. Maybe I shouldn't, I'm never going to go through all of these individually, but as well as metaphysical intuitions, there's also epistemic ones, like the idea that experience is specially self-illuminating, which I think is sometimes taken in an inflationary way that would preclude materialist reduction. And another one that's quite close to my heart is just this intuition of a bit of a profound metaphysical difference. So there's all this talk of like lights on and lights off that you see in debates about consciousness. But I think people tend to then read it in a metaphysical way where there's just, it means that there's this huge difference metaphysically between whether you have the special inner light or you lack it. And that's another intuition that I very much want to apply debunking arguments to. Finally, another relevant case that I'm thinking about a lot in the context of debunking arguments in discussions of consciousness is just a really familiar one, I think probably to all of you, is the debate that comes up for the epiphenomenalist dualist about whether they can really reconstruct knowledge of experience. So as you probably know, epiphenomenalist dualists like Frank Jackson got accused of having a view that made it just unintelligible how we could have knowledge of experience. Like if you have a causal theory of knowledge, then if experience doesn't cause our judgments, how can we know about experience? So I think that's one of the really classic applications of debunking in the literature. And thinking of it as a test case for how we think about debunking in general, I think is quite helpful. So I'm going to be bearing that in mind as we go along. Okay. So that's all just the setup. Now what I want to do is talk a little bit more about how I'm thinking about different kinds of debunking arguments. So we're now into a little bit more of the meat of the talk. So one distinction here is between the target of the debunking argument. So one kind of debunking argument is what I call a truth-directed one, where someone has a belief that P, and then you try and dissuade them from having that belief by arguing that not P. Okay. So someone might believe in dualism, and then you try to talk them out of it by arguing to them that physicalism is true. that's not so much what I'm interested in here, although the truth of beliefs is going to be highly relevant in a more indirect way. I'm more interested in what we might call justification-directed or knowledge-directed debunking arguments. In particular, arguments of the following form, where you challenge the believer and you ask them to explain how it is that their belief is formed in a truth-conducive way. So if it turns out that on that believer's own story about how their belief is formed, it would just be a complete coincidence that it was true. Then the idea is that if they acknowledge that, and they can't tell a convincing story about how they're justified, then that thereby undermines their justification for having that belief. And we can be neutral here on whether they were justified before in having this belief, and this merely undermines the justification, or whether it means that they were never justified all along. I'm not going to get into that point yet. But the idea is that if you can't answer this challenge, then that's a serious threat to your belief. Okay. So that's one point. And then the second thing that I want to put on the table, and this is a really important distinction for me, is a distinction between what I call a by my lights challenge and a by your lights challenge. So a by my lights challenge is like this. It says something like this: please explain, given only assumptions that I, the challenger, accept, how your belief is reliably formed, or otherwise in good epistemic shape. So you're basically asking them to reconstruct a justification that then I, the challenger, can accept, and therefore wouldn't lead to me having this belief. Whereas a by your lights challenge is asking the challenged person to merely explain from within their own worldview how their belief is reliably formed, or otherwise in good shape. And that in order to meet that challenge, you don't have to appeal to materials that the challenger themselves accepts. Okay, so you can just sort of bootstrap your way up in a sort of holistic or circular way. So just to illustrate here, suppose Philomena has a direct intuition that consciousness is non-physical, and then she builds a dualist worldview around that. And a materialist wants to come along and give a kind of debunking argument against her whole picture. So they might give what I would call a by my lights challenge of the following form. They might say, look, I can explain in purely material terms why Philomena had this intuition. And so I thereby declare her worldview debunked, because given my point of view, I can explain why she had this intuition in a way that does not in any way suggest that it supports dualism. Now, from Philomena's point of view, that might not seem particularly disturbing or challenging. She's basically I think she should just say something like this: whatever. From my point of view, that materialism is just a sort of is like an uninteresting skeptical hypothesis. It's true that if materialism was true, then it might have all the same intuitions, but that's a bit like saying if I was a brain in a vat, then I would have all the same perceptions, something like that. All that matters to me is whether, from my point of view, I can explain why I have these dualist intuitions. And to do that, I can just assume that dualism is true, and then tell a story on about how my dualist intuitions track that fact. So, for example, she might say, oh yeah, there's this special direct acquaintance thing, and that just reveals to me that these dualist properties exist out there in the world. Or she might appeal to divine intervention, like maybe God is no deceiver, and so my sense that dualism is true cannot be false. So I'm hoping that this is a kind of familiar dialectic. This comes up all the time in philosophy in different types of debates, like with moral realism, or with, I was thinking this morning about the debate about time. So some B theorists will try and explain away A theoretical intuitions in entirely B theoretical terms. But it's not clear how dialectically effective that is, because the A theorist can come back and say, well, all that really matters is that on the assumption that the A theory is true, there's some explanation of why my A theoretical intuitions track those A theoretical facts. The fact that someone who has a completely different worldview can explain my intuitions isn't necessarily all that disturbing. That's just a sort of skeptic. From my point of view, that's just like skepticism. So I think hopefully that's familiar to everyone. So my idea about this is that we don't have to leave things just in terms of that familiar kind of back and forth between mere skeptical challenge and sort of circular justification. And that there's a kind of middle ground that you can find between those things that is helpful for sort of making some progress in this dialectical stalemate. So that's the thing that I'm going to try to give some flesh to now. I'm going to throw some like terminology at you now with the hope that it's not completely bamboozling. So let's see how this goes. So here's some definitions. So one thing I want to talk about is just what I'm going to call the first order coherence of someone's worldview. And that's the overall coherence or degree of coherence of their worldview, but bracketing the question of where the assumptions that worldview was built on actually come from in the first place. So an example would be a dualist worldview that is built on dualist intuitions, but ignoring where those intuitions came from in the first place. Okay. And then what I'm going to call a meta-coherent worldview is a worldview that we're assuming now that it's first order coherent, and then furthermore, it doesn't rule out logically or probabilistically some reasonable story of how the assumptions on which it's built are non-coincidentally true. Okay. So it's kind of a pretty low bar, but the idea is that the worldviews that are not meta-coherent do come up in a real way in these debates. So actually a good example is the epiphenomenalist dualist. So I think the idea of the early materialist challenges was that that's not even meta-coherent, because if these special dualist properties that you believe in don't have any effects, then there's just no way that you could know about them. So your whole worldview sort of undermines itself by being not meta-coherent thing. And then a meta-complete worldview is one that is both meta-coherent and then actually spells out that origin story for where the assumptions come from. Okay. And then what I'm going to call an epistemic equilibrium is a worldview that's both first order and meta-coherent. Okay. And now what I also want to do is, now we've got this idea of an epistemic equilibrium. Now we can imagine like this sort of space of equilibria that one could end up in, sort of in the end game of the debate about the metaphysics of consciousness. As well as being both coherent and meta-coherent, I want to say that a worldview can have a further sort of desirable epistemic property, which I'm going to call meta-reliability. And meta-reliability is like this, that you imagine that you've got your worldview and then there's a bunch of other worldviews that are in equilibrium that are like challenges to your worldview. Your worldview is reliable provided it's defensible against all of those challenges, which basically means that there aren't any nearby worldviews that are also in equilibrium. Something like that. So, an example of this would be if it turns out that a bunch of people who start off with different priors and who all get the same evidence or the same theory of the world, then that would mean that theory of the world not only is coherent and maybe meta-coherent too, but also has this nice meta-reliability where people who started in different places would also converge that way. Or another example might be a community of people where people have different priors and also somewhat different evidence. For example, they might all believe that birds exist. And so that view would be meta-reliable in the sense that it's sort of, you would get at it from all these different starting points. Okay. So the point is that meta-reliability is not as strong as skeptic resistance. So skeptic resistance is like, you could survive any debunking challenge from any other point of view. And we all know that that's just way too demanding. That basically requires that your view is noble, big or something like that. But here the idea is that there's this intermediate thing, meta-reliability, that's in between just being sort of coherent and having a coherent story about how your own view is reliably formed. It's also sort of defensible against some certain range of other challenges. Okay. Whose views are not too distant from yours. For example, with the bird thing, you could have like someone who has some crazy bird conspiracy theory that's just built on completely different assumptions about the world, whereby they think that birds don't exist and they're just robots or something. You can still be meta-reliable even if you're not defending yourself against sort of crazy worldviews that are really far from yours in sort of the space of different equilibria. Okay. So So that's one property, and then there's also this property I want to call metastability. So metastability is a sort of thing, epistemically desirable property of a worldview that you might fall back on if you can't get meta-reliability. So here what we imagine is that we've got some different worldviews that are actually quite close to each other. So it could be physicalism and certain versions of dualism. And it turns out they're both in equilibrium. But then it also turns out that there's some further epistemic desideratum that everyone agrees is good for a theory to have. It might be something like simplicity, or how revisionary the theory is. And it turns out that although you've got these different equilibria nearby each other, maybe one of them involves, say, a simpler worldview. And everyone agrees that that is desirable, nothing else is desirable. So if one equilibria beats another on all desired further desiderata, then it ends up being metastable. Okay, that's what I mean by that. So then, bearing that in mind, and I hope that's not completely bamboozling, here's another way of describing the dialectic between the dualist and materialist that I was just describing that gets into a slightly more fine-grained way of characterizing the dialectic. So first of all, a sort of pessimistic view. I think this is sort of a way of thinking that is really common in consciousness circles. The idea is that materialism, although the materialist can paint a both coherent and meta-coherent view, they can explain where all their intuitions come from and so on. The idea is that nonetheless the view is not meta-reliable in the sense that there are these versions of dualism that are sort of materialist adjacent. For example, they accept physical causal closure. And that those views are also in equilibrium. Like the people who hold those views can describe a coherent epistemology for where all the intuitions came from and so on. And so we've just got these close together equilibria that we can't decide between. And then furthermore, we can't decide between them in terms of further desiderata, because although the materialist view might be better than the dualist one by being more simple, the dualists complain that the materialist one is worse than the dualist one by being more revisionary. So we're sort of trading off simplicity and revisionariness, and so we still can't really break the deadlock between these views that are close to each other and both in equilibrium. But my ambition is to sort of have a more optimistic take on the dialectic in favor of the materialist. What I want to say is that no, materialism is meta-reliable, because all versions of dualism that are at least materialist adjacent, in fact, don't have a good story about their epistemology. They're all built on assumptions that are generated by intuitions that are themselves actually not defensible on the dualist's own terms. And therefore, those dualist views are actually not in epistemic equilibrium, ultimately, when you think things through. There might be dualist views that are a bit like the conspiracy theories that involve God intervening, or like a weird metaphysical scanner in the head and things like that. But the materialist doesn't want you to worry about them because they're way far off in epistemic space. And secondly, I want to say, even if that's wrong and materialism is not meta-reliable, that is metastable, because not only is it simpler than dualism, it's just wrong to say that it bears the cost of being revisionary in a bad way. Rather, in fact, it actually wins on that criterion as well, understood properly, because it's modest in an attractive way, not illusionist in a costly way. So it beats the dualist equilibrium on both fronts. Okay, so that's my little spiel, trying to kind of dig a bit more into how debunking works. Let's see. I'm totally not being tracking time. How much more time do I have? I think we're going about half an hour. Is that right?
Like 20 minutes. 15.
15 left.
15. Between 15 and
15, 20. Okay, I think I can do it. Okay. Okay. So now we've got into a little bit more into like how to think about debunking arguments and how they work. I want to talk a little bit more about how someone who wants to defend metaphysically inflationary ideas about experience could defend those intuitions against a debunking challenge. Well, now I want to be clear that it's what I'm calling a by your lights debunking challenge. So it's not merely the kind of boring thing of the materialist explaining in materialist terms where the intuitions come from, which doesn't have much dialectical force. It's the challenge that says that you, even granted your inflationary metaphysics, can't explain how your view is metacoherent. That's the challenge. So given any one of these examples, here's 4 ways you might go to try and defend it. You might just say, oh yeah, let's just build it into the definitions of the concepts that I'm using that say dualism is true or special kind of intentionalism is true or whatever it is. That's one. Second is just introspection. You're just like, look, it's really obvious from introspection that, I don't know, experience is qualitative in some special physicalist, incompatible way. Thirdly, there's what I call a constitutive defense. And this should be really familiar to everyone from the epiphenomenalist dualist discussion, where a really popular move has been to say, look, it's not that phenomenal properties cause my phenomenal judgments. It's that these phenomenal properties are actually just constitutively embedded in those judgments in such a way that I couldn't even think that this phenomenal property is here without it being instantiated. And so it's like my judgment is sort of self-verifying by its very metaphysical nature or something like that. So that's one kind of response against the debunker. And then fourthly, at least in some cases, you could give what I call a theoretical defense, where basically you say, yeah, fine, I mean, intuitions don't really bias this metaphysics, but when we just reason theoretically about the best story that we want to tell about the world, it will commit to this metaphysics anyway, and then that will, and it also will explain where those intuitions come from in a way that gives us a nice coherent package. So through theoretical reasoning, we can sort of shore up the function. Okay, so I just want to. There's a lot to say about each of these, and it's a bit absurd to go through them quickly now, especially at this level of generality. But I just want to say briefly why it seems to me that these tend to fail in pretty much all of these examples. So the definitional one, I think maybe this is going to be like less controversial. There's just this basic point that we always have to bear in mind. You can't really justify believing in a certain metaphysical picture of the world just by building certain things in by definition. Like the act of defining doesn't sort of make the world a certain way. I think this is a sort of quite old Quinian point. So sure, I could just decide to build dualism into the definition of my phenomenal concept, but then it's just no longer obvious that when I apply it to my experience, it actually applies to that experience, because it's not obvious that dualism is true. And I have to say, although I think that should be uncontroversial, this kind of thing does happen a lot in philosophy of consciousness. One case that is a bit of a bugbear of mine is the unity of consciousness. So sometimes people say that it's just part of the very idea of an experience that some kind of holistic view is true, where it's like a holistic phenomenal field whereby the whole has metaphysical priority over the part. And people like Tim Bain come very close to saying that's just sort of part of the definition of an experience. Something like that. But you can't make it the case that we have these holistic phenomenal fields just by building it into the definition. I don't think so. So yeah. I think that's never going to be very persuasive. Okay. What about introspection? This also is a bit of a bugbear. Okay, so people often say they can just that there's a special relation of acquaintance or revelation or something like that that just reveals to them the nature of phenomenal properties. Okay. Now, I don't have an objection to this necessarily if it's understood in a sufficiently deflationary way, where appeal to acquaintance and appeal to the things you say or reveal to you is understood loosely enough that it's all just materialist compatible. That's fine. It's when it starts becoming this way of reading off substantial metaphysics that it really bugs me quite a lot. And here's one way I think of getting at the problem here. There's two ways that you can understand the deliverances of alleged faculties of acquaintance, revelation, or just introspection. In like a propositional or a non-propositional way. So we just grant that there's some special alien feature that we're acquainted with. I actually, for my current purposes, I don't have a problem with someone saying that they're sort of directly acquainted with that in a non-propositional way. It's just sort of present to the mind. What becomes problematic is if you say that then thereby delivers propositional knowledge about the nature of the metaphysics of the thing. For example, it's the kind of thing that could not be reduced to materialist terms. it's a special kind of intentionality that involves, a relation between an intentional relation between a subject and a quality or something. Once you say that that's delivered by introspection, then I'm like, how could that possibly be delivered by introspection? It's not like there's a metaphysical scanner inside our head that looks at the properties and sort of analyzes their metaphysics and then just delivers that to us, pre-packaged in a kind of propositional form, and then we can reason about it in philosophy and that kind of thing. It just seems to me obvious that doesn't exist, or at least it doesn't exist, if anything, like the picture of how the mind works that we get from cognitive science is true. Maybe there's some distant possible world where we have metaphysical scanners or weird conspiratorial psychophysical laws that ensure that our metaphysical intuitions are correct or something like that, or God's intervening to make sure that we're not deceived about metaphysics or something. But that's way too remote for the materialists to worry about. That's a distant equilibrium, not a close equilibrium. Okay. Again, I want to emphasize that my argument here is not a more familiar one to the effect that these alien features would be epiphenomenal and therefore unknowable. It's not that. It's the specific knowledge of their sort of unpacks their metaphysics is not something that could be delivered by introspection. Okay. So I'll just leave it at that for now. The constitutive defense is the thing that I mentioned that appeals to the very nature of phenomenal concepts. And I'm just going to say something really briefly about this and then move on because I have limited time. My complaint here is something like this. Maybe that works just for the very existence of phenomenal properties. In the way that people like Dave Chalmers have suggested as a defense of epiphenomenalist dualism. But what matters here is knowledge of not just the existence of a phenomenal property or its instantiation, but more substantive metaphysics. I don't see how this kind of constitutive view can deliver that. I mean, you could try to sort of build into the very nature of phenomenal concepts that they have a conceptual role that enables you to make metaphysical inferences of some kind. But then we can just ask, well, what justifies us in using this kind of loaded phenomenal concept that by definition enables you to make these inferences rather than a more modest one? So it sort of turns into the debate about the definitional defense at that point. Or someone could link it to introspection, but then it just turns into the debate about introspection. So it's hard for me to see a way forward here that really is persuasive. I think I'm just going to skip the theoretical thing so that I have just a minute or two about the final part of the talk. So that's just a little bit on why, that was a little bit on why I think these defenses against by your likes debunking arguments don't tend to seem to be very persuasive to me, and therefore why I think ultimately views on which there's these alien features that make consciousness inexplicable are not really in close equilibrium to materialist views. Okay. So the final part of this is just to talk a little bit about strong illusionism and how it plays through a similar dialectic thinking about debunking arguments and the way that I want to think about them. The thing I've been thinking about recently here is this idea that there's a way of understanding strong illusionism, the claim that consciousness doesn't exist, whereby you can believe that, but still, in a sense, believe that there are experiences in another sense. Let me explain. So there's a view that I want to call token realism. That would be the view that just a particular token mental event, like a headache, exists. So I might introspect a headache and think, oh yes, this headache exists. Okay. And then there's what I want to call subtype realism, whereby we're not talking about experience or consciousness in general terms, but we're just talking about subtypes like headaches or visual percepts or color experiences. So the subtype realist says, yeah, there's such a thing as being a headache. That is a real property. Okay. Now the type realist goes further. The type realist says that there's this overarching category that all these things that we can introspect fall under. So it's a bit like the thing that happens at the beginning of a consciousness 101 class, when you're trying to sort of give people the intuition about what phenomenology is, and you say, oh yeah, like there's headaches, and they feel a certain way. And there's visual percepts, they feel a certain way, they're subjective, there's something it's like. And we're supposed to sort of glom onto this idea that there's this overarching category that's a natural category that incorporates all these like different kinds of experiences. And so what I think one way of hearing the claim that consciousness exists is a sort of realism about this overarching category. But it seems to me you could be a kind of anti-realist about the overarching category, even though you think that things like headaches exist. And that would be a kind of strong illusionist view, even though it's not like, the way that people usually understand strong illusionism is it would mean that even things like headaches don't exist. And that's why it seems so implausible. But if headaches exist, but just consciousness doesn't exist, then I think that's maybe a bit more of a palatable way of going forward. And not only that, I mean, if you start thinking about it, this intuition that there's this overarching category, where does that even come from? What is this faculty that we have whereby we can contemplate all these apparently different things and then just sort of know directly that there's this natural category that they all fall under? I mean, why is that reliable? And you might worry that we could empirically investigate what kinds of things headaches are, what kinds of things visual percepts are. And it might turn out that when we just look in the brain, that they don't really have anything in common beyond the fact that we call them experience and they sort of loosely play a role that means that that concept appropriately applies to them. But beyond that, there isn't something like integrated information or a global neuronal workspace that they're all feeding into such that they all have like some really special nice thing in common that makes them conscious. Maybe it's just what we create things. So I call that the bad result. If it turns out, it seems to me that we should probably think that it's just an empirically open question of whether or not the bad result could turn out to be true. I'm going to actually, I'm basically going to run out of time. I'm just going to skip over some of this, but let me just briefly say a tiny bit about how this then plays through the debunking dialectic. So I actually think it's not at all obvious what we should say if the bad result turns out to be true, like whether in what exact sense that would mean that consciousness doesn't exist. But suppose that the right thing to say is that if you've got the bad result and you're a physicalist, that means that consciousness is not a thing. That's the right way to talk. Some kind of illusionism is true. Now, one view would be a kind of ultra-Morian view on which that type, what I call the type realist intuition, is so Morian, it's just so obvious that there's this thing, what it's likeness or consciousness or something like that. Then insofar as the bad result plus physicalism entails illusionism, if we get the bad result, we should just be dualist. So we should basically say, yeah, at the physical level, these things don't have anything in common, but there's this special non-physical commonality that they have. And I think it's interesting to think about whether that kind of ultra-Morian view really is defensible. Like, first of all, is it really that insanely obvious that there is this thing, consciousness? My own intuition is that once we clearly distinguish token and subtype realism from type realism, it's not actually completely obvious that type realism is true. There's people like disjunctivists out there that arguably whose views can arguably be span in this kind of illusionist way. Like, no one thinks that they're completely insane. But another interesting thing is that it's not obvious that ultra-Morianism has this property that I was calling metacoherence. And that's because on the kind of picture that I'm imagining, if it's all just disjunctive at the physical level, then what is ultimately generating their type realist intuition is just this disjunction at the physical level that just coincidentally happens to match up with this special magical non-physical property at the higher level. But if the right picture was that it's really the disjunctive physical stuff that's generating the type realist intuition, then there's this kind of weird disconnect between the content of the intuition and what's generating the intuition. And so you might worry that they're in a bit of a pickle that's a bit like the epiphenomenalist dualist pickle, whereby they're saying that it's insanely obvious that something is true, but then they can't really tell a good story about how they could have this ultra-reliable insight in the first place. So let's see. I don't want to like really rudely overrun something. I'm just going to wrap up. Let me just say, so where I feel myself landing these days is on this view that I might want to call ultra-banal realism or something like that. So that's banal realism in the way that I was explaining earlier. But I'm calling it ultra-banal because maybe I want to include in the package a sort of agnosticism about type realism as well. In other words, I'm saying that even a strong belief in that consciousness is a thing as a sort of general overarching type is too inflationary, and we don't really know that. We should just investigate it empirically. So if you really want to be genuinely modest, even that is going too far, and you should just hold back and wait for empirical investigation to tell us like whether even consciousness even exists as an overarching category. And then finally, again, just to sort of tee this up for debate, I want to reiterate that my view is that if you're a banal realist in this epistemic sense, then you should also think that the whole problem is kind of dissolved because you refuse to accept any intuitions about experience that would imply that there's anything inexplicable about it. I mean, everything that we want to say about experience can just be given as straightforward semantics in terms of underlying physical processes, and it's all just perfectly intelligible and reducible and so on, and so we end up with a kind of nice happy face result for the materialist. Okay, so I'll just say that. Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. It was very interesting. So from here, Bryan, do you have?
Yeah, sure.
Nice to see you.
Sorry, I was trying to great, thank you so much. This is cool. I guess I worry. I'll say the worry first, and I'll try to say more about it. But I worry that the defense from the materialistic is going to be subject to similar charges. And the one year, I forget the European definitional and the introspection and the constitutive complaints, but I feel like analogous complaints will arise for the materialists, especially because presumably there is something such as being too deflationary or too revisionary, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't capture the phenomenon. But where the line is going to be a matter of either intuition or definition, and that is going to look as bad as the line drawn to the other direction. Does this make sense? I mean, this is a little bit.
I can see why a dualist might think that, but I would push back. So the materialist isn't just like their view isn't just resting on an intuition or something like that. The idea is that if it's meta-coherent, then not only do they have intuitions about what the world is like, but like from within their own worldview, they can explain well where those intuitions come from in a way where it turns out that they're reliable.
Right.
So it's a bit like and that will include intuitions about experience understood in a sufficiently deflationary way. So if they have intuitions like we experience objects as having colors or something like that, the idea is that in the end of the day, there'll be a whole story about where those intuitions about experiencing objects come from, such that it'll turn out that those intuitions were tracking a real thing that's going on in my brain, and were actually reliable. So it doesn't. Yes, everything rests on intuitions in the end of the day, but you can have a sort of reflective equilibrium whereby the intuitions themselves can be vindicated by the very story that they generated or something like that. And I'm saying that you can't even get that on the dualist view.
Can I say something? Yeah.
Yes, you have also a follow-up.
Yeah, just a quick. But then it seems to me that the opponent, the dualist, can come back and say, well, but I can also give that story, and the reason why I can give that story is because, sorry, I'm tired and I lost what I was saying. It's because what you're giving me is not enough to account for the phenomenon. So it's not really like something that is internally incoherent. Is that the deliverance of the deflationary view is not enough to account for the phenomenon I'm trying to say. So your view. You're my opponent. Your view doesn't give me the minimum what I take to be sufficient to account for the phenomenon.
Yeah, but that's an intuition, and then that's where I wanted to ask for an explanation of where that intuition comes from and how it can. So, for example, some people want to say, "Oh, yeah, experience is subjective in a special way."
Right.
And what physics gives us is objective, and it's just, and then they say, "I'm just understanding it subjective in a special metaphysical way, whereby nothing objective could explain something subjective. And so you can say that, but then I want to say, okay, well, how do you know that experience is subjective in this special way?
Right, but the flip side is...
And then that's where I'm saying it's not meta-coherent, because do you know it by definition? Do you know it by introspection? What? And I'm saying you don't have a good story to tell about what could have generated that intuition in a sort of truth-tracking, reliable way.
But I feel like the flip side is true too, right? Like when the deflationist says that is enough, that also relies on an intuition. And now I can say exactly this. I want to say what backs up that intuition, and I can press in the very same way, but on the other side. But
because the materialist, the idea of banal materialism is that all we're saying about experience, all the claims we're making about experience are ones we can back up in the way that I'm saying the dualist can't back up their intuition. So it's supposed to be asymmetrical in that way.
Yeah.
And it's because we're only saying things that are really boring about experience, such that it's much easier to tell a story about how we can know those things. Whereas the dualist wants to say these exciting, exotic things about experience that are much harder to back up. So I don't accept that there's this sort of symmetry between the views whereby they do equally badly, or at least that's my aspiration.
I'll put myself in the queue to say more.
Okay.
Can I
You have a follow-up?
Yeah, so my question was fairly similar to Carlos, but maybe let me try to express it from a different angle. So I was thinking about the Pythagorean. The Pythagorean believes that everything is number, and there's no such thing as physical reality over and above number. So I think that the phenomenal realist stands to the illusionist in a similar position to how the illusionist stands to the Pythagorean. Because the illusionist who believes in physical reality, that's not just a matter of like more numbers. I mean, you could say like, look, it's really obvious that physical reality exists, and it's obvious that there's some unifying property that all physical objects have in common that distinguishes them from just mere mathematical objects. But I guess I wonder if it seems to me like the difficulty for the illusionists to justify that, even by their own lights, over the Pythagorean is analogous to the difficulty for the phenomenal realist to justify their view over the illusionist. So in that respect, that's a slightly different way of expressing the symmetry point, but that's one way in which it seems to me that there's a dialectical symmetry.
Let's see if I'm not entirely sure I'm tracking, so let's just go with this slowly. So I agree that there's a certain type of physicalist who wants their view to be non-Pythagorean, because they just think, oh, it sounds really insane to be a Pythagorean. And then they just appeal to like an intuition that the world is non-Pythagorean or something like that.
Yeah.
And I agree that the way that I'm thinking, I'm committed to challenging that kind of physicalist to explain where that non-Pythagorean intuition comes from in such a way that it could track reality as it's configured. And if it turns out that, that's a weird one, because probably what explains that intuition.
How do we know about this weird physical stuff?
I agree. So I think the kind of physicalism I like would be fairly neutral about ultimately what the things like spatial relations and temporal relations are. Maybe Pythagoreanism is a view of that, is an acceptable view of this is left on the table at least as to what, say, spatial relations actually are.
Well, it's not just a view about space and time, but a view about physical reality in general, so including physical objects.
I mean, in general, my whole approach is to avoid appeal to intuition in philosophy as much as possible. Well, not quite like intuitions that cannot be backed up in this kind of reflected equilibrium kind of way.
Methodologically, you and I are on the same page.
I mean, everything, it has to all be circular and bootstrapped. I mean, we can't defeat, I'm not a Kantian who thinks it can all just be built up a priori or something. So we'll lean on kind of intuitive axioms at a certain level, but there's cases where it can have this kind of this sort of nice meta-coherence, and cases where it can't. I think I agree with you that this particular materialist is a kind of hypocrite that is whose view is problematic in just the way that I'm saying the dualist is. So is that a problem for me to?
Well, I admire your intellectual honesty, but I think that most physicalists are not that intellectually honest, and I guess I'm happy that if
there might be theoretical arguments against Pythagoreanism, but that would be different.
Right.
But if it's just a brute intuition that's crazy, then yeah.
Sure. So then my thought is just that standard physicalism, the non-Pythagorean version,
Yeah.
I think that might be in an unstable middle position. And if you agree with me, then even if you notice opponents where I notice tolerance, then I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
Even the dialectic thing.
I mean, it's actually pretty demanding, like a full account of where all our intuitions come from, such that they all turn out to be reliable, is actually like quite demanding. And it wouldn't surprise me that if it turns out we just have basic principles that we're using to model the world that cannot meet that standard. If it turns out that any view is going to be like that, then really the competition is not so much between views that have that nice feature and views that don't, more like views that can do that as much as possible and views that fail to do that as much. Something like that.
Yeah, I like you.
I haven't really thought,
Yeah.
but when you said like, but the deflationist or I forget, the ultra-banal realist or whatever, is just relying on these boring intuitions that are like uncontroversial, whatever. I guess what's controversial and substantial is the claim that that's enough, that's enough to account for what's to be accounted for. And that's a substantive claim that presumably relies on an intuition.
But then, sorry if you
No,
too
go
much ago.
ahead.
But then I want to know more about this sense that there's not enough. Like that's basically the whole problem. And then there's two ways to go. One is the traditional like inferential gap kind of thing, and then, which I didn't talk about this at all. But my view is that that's just not convincing as an explanatory puzzle. And then the other idea is no, there's some special like what I'm calling alien features that experience has that just by their very metaphysics preclude reduction. But then if you're going to claim that there's something there that can't be explained, you've got to tell me how you know that there's those alien features there. And that's the point at which I think you're not going to be able to.
But the flip side is true too, right? Like I can ask you, where is that intuition that that's enough coming from? And how do you justify that?
Yeah, I wanted to offer you a fifth way for the anti-physicalists to tell the origin story about their hard problem inducing intuition.
Yeah.
Which I think is the true story. I mean, I say that as a physicalist. I think that's the true story of where that comes from. So it's going to be a folk ontology story. So the folk ontology divides reality into three ontological categories. I'm just going to tell you. It divides reality into three categories, which are basically the categories Frege talked about, the material, the mental, and the third realm of abstract. And because these are ontological categories, reductions across these categories are just unintelligible. So if a philosopher of mathematics says, I have a theory of seven is a mix of mango smoothie and cement, you can say a priori, that's just not, you can say to this philosopher of mathematics, look, you can claim that there is no number seven, and that there is mango, smoothie, and cement mixed together, but you cannot claim that one is the other. That's just ruled out a priori because it would be a cross-categorical monstrosity. And likewise, when someone says, the phenomenology of being irritable just is neurons describe a neural process. And the kind of the folk ontology kind of somehow rules that out as not allowed. And so it cannot be that. You can be actually an eliminativist or an illusionist and say actually there are no such things as phenomenology of irritability, but to say that all it is this something, and it would be the Pythagorean, it would be the same kind of like cross-categorical, inadmissible, a priori inadmissible reduction. And so this is where it comes from. it's a little bit, I think what this kind of folk ontology generates is more, it's a disjunction of anti-physicalism and eliminative physicalism. What it rules out are these kind of more conciliatory forms of physicalism. What do you think about this?
Well, first of all, there's sort of two ways of understanding that story. One is just as a sort of causal origin story, like for why psychologically we have intuitions of some kind. And another would be as a sort of justification for endorsing those intuitions.
That's not.
So I mean, my four-part taxonomy was more about the justification side than just the sort of purely the origin side. But they are kind of related because when you're trying to justify an intuition, you want to know where it came from. I mean, well, having said that, it sounds like the definitional defense. It sounds like what you're saying is that it's just built into the very idea of experience that there's this tripartite ontology in the world. And so insofar as that's not the ontology of the world, then experience doesn't exist.
It just didn't seem as silly as saying, oh, well, let me define consciousness as something of which dualism is true.
It's very close to that, isn't it?
No, because there's something that's happening kind of independently, where it's like the little mind comes to the world and kind of tries to make sense of it and orders it. Yeah. And it orders it along like genus, species, and subspecies. And then there's like three sum genera, the material, the mental, and the abstract. And that kind of comes before you, like a philosopher starts creating definitions to try to generate.
Well, and I mean, another thing to say is that my way of thinking of this is, insofar as you understand something like that in a really metaphysically inflationary way that would just rule out reduction, then they're like debunk. But then there's always the option of giving it a more modest deflationary interpretation, where, that's the folk categorization, but materialists can say, it's not that it's completely wrong, like there really is this special category of mental things that has its own special kind of functional computational features and so on. It's just not ontologically fundamental. So the folk were picking up on a real joint in the world, but it's not as jointy as the more inflationary take would. So.
I'm not saying this fifth thing is impossible to handle. I just think it's fifth.
Yes. Thank you. So I'm not completely clear about what are the rules of the game. So part of it came into discussion. So I would like to ask you just about one simple case and see whether this kind of explanation on behalf of a view would be acceptable by the rules of the game that you mentioned for type realism. So imagine that in defense of type realism, someone brings into, so in favor of type realism, somebody brings like this, the alienness that you were mentioning. So there is this type, which is consciousness all across the board, because and there is this thing that they have in common that is the alienness, and I provide, of course, in order to be metastable, I would need to provide an explanation, set them aside, but I want this feature that they seem to have in favor of the type realism. And somebody said, no, but how it's really, so, but here are different kinds of alienness. So this is alien because of A, this is alien because of B, but still have the alienness. So would that be sufficient to justify metaphysically this common kind, or how would that work? How would the discussion work in order to be a realist about what is an illusionist, etc.?
So is the question what exactly it means to say that there's a common kind? Is that the question?
Yeah, so how in this framework?
I think that is a good question, and I think it is rather unclear. So as a result, I think it's rather unclear in some cases whether a view is best described as illusionist or just sort of deflationary realist. So certainly I would count a dualist view as type realist, assuming that it says that there's this overarching determinable consciousness, such that all other experiences are sort of determinate, something like that. So it would be a bit like mass. And the determinants would be like individual masses, like Jupiter's round and Jupiter's round. So that's one kind of type of view. But I was imagining that there could be like reductive physicalist type realist views as well, where there's something that's like recognizably a scientific natural kind that they all have in common. So I take it that's what, when people go for things like IIT, like theories of consciousness, that's the kind of thing they go for. But then I think there's a sort of like slightly messy, muddy middle ground where suppose it doesn't turn out that anything like IIT is true, that it's a bit more disjunctive. What headaches and visual experiences have in common. But maybe they have more, but maybe like there's still commonalities there. Maybe it's, I mean, you can imagine a really extreme disjunctive view where they literally have nothing in common at all, other than the fact that we call them experiences. That I think it's a bit like jade with like jadeite and nephrite and something like that. But I think it's unlikely that it's going to turn out that bad because I think what goes into calling things experience in the first place tends to involve them having certain role properties, like that we can immediately judge that they're there and things like that. So they're likely to at least loosely have some functional role properties in common and not be like really radically disjunctive. I think we kind of already know enough to know that that kind of anti-realism probably isn't going to play out. But then if all they have in common is just loosely some role properties, yeah, consciousness exists, but it's only in this really deflated sense. So it's sort of middle ground between illusionism and realism.
So how would
So does that help?
So I was trying to understand really how the dialectic works to bring it to some debate. So for example, imagine that Anna asserts and I deny, or the other way around, that we're having a discussion on type realism. And what I was trying to figure out is what do we have to bring into the table in order to play the game according to your rules, pre-theoretica. So do we have to really get into the all details about what really means or what is the best way to articulate that? Or can we really have this debate where should we be type realism or what is bad or good on being type realist?
I mean, I'm not sure there are like totally clear rules of the game again. But I mean, I'm thinking of it a bit like the way that someone might have a debate about whether, I mean, scientific natural kind is a good example. Like it might seem sometimes like there's a unified category, and then it actually turns out that's rather disjunctive. There's this book called Fish Don't Exist, where, I mean, the book's not just about fish, actually, it's about, it's not what it's about. But the reason why it's called Fish Don't Exist is because there's this idea that the entities that we call fish are just a whole bunch of diverse marine life that are on different parts of the evolutionary tree of life and don't have much in common other than the fact they live under the water. So, if it's like that, then of course there's a sense in which fish exist. You can still keep using the word fish and apply it to things. But still, like, there's some truth to the idea that, like, being a fish isn't really a thing. And so that's how I'm thinking about the consciousness case too. I mean, even if it turns out that it's pretty disjunctive, we'll probably continue to use the word experience and apply it to all these different things, and in everyday life it'll become can say truly I'm having an experience. But it'll just turn out that it's not a natural category.
I think this is a version of what has been going on, but it also might take us back to an argument we didn't really want to talk about that, which is the explanatory gap sort of argument. But I mean, I kind of have as also, I think of it as an origin story that's a little bit different than your eyes, but it's more sort of like, look, I find myself in a position where, I've got certain elements out of which I can construct a world. And let's say that I start with just like math. Let's say I start with 2 and plus, right? Yeah. And then I have a headache. I'm like, okay, so let's see, how am I going to get a headache from 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2? And supposedly says, just keep adding. You're going to get a headache. Or no, it's going to eventually equal headache, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have a headache, but you keep adding. I'm going to say, no. And you say, well, I don't know why you think that. I'm just going to say, well, nothing's going to be more sure of anything when I have a headache. So let's add something in. So you add physical processes. And then I look and I'm like, I'm kind of in a similar position with that. And something like me, I'm not like, I don't know what's so special about headaches. I don't have any special property. I just don't see how this gets me there. And it's just, well, I'm not trying to kind of insist this is all that special, or even that headaches really bear anything deeply in common with the taste of bacon. Although I also can't see why the taste of bacon would come out of 2 + 2 or especially neurons. And you can say like, well, I can see how you say ow, and I get that. And I mean, I guess I guess I have a hard time not going back to sort of the explanatory gap argument in a way, because it just looks like at some point there's going to be a debate about like, well, you know, this is an explanandum. I'm just going to take this as an explanandum. Not that it's a particular way, but like, you know, it's not just saying ow, it's feeling like this, right? And there's nothing that seems to me to come out of 2 + 2 or, you know, zap plus zap that causes it to feel like this. Maybe that makes it constantly like this. So I'm just kind of like constantly making the story work there, because it seems like it lets you kind of disallow my data, right? Which looks like you can do to anybody. I'm still got this puzzle. I just don't see how this adds up to that.
Yeah, well, let me start. I was following you until right at the end, so let me, but anyway, let's.
I love it when everybody calls you to the conclusion.
Just the bit about debunking, I'm not sure.
Okay.
The whole thing about I was following all the rest of it.
Yeah.
I'm suspicious of the idea that what's generating your you can't get headaches out of numbers intuition is just purely that you can't infer headache facts from number facts, like the traditional no a priori derivability sort of idea of an explanatory gap. And that's because I think you can come up with examples where you've got that lack of a priori derivability and we don't have that kind of intuition that you're talking about. Yeah.
Well, even if I say it's...
Yeah, so that makes me think that there's more going on than just lack of a priori derivability that's giving you that intuition you can't get headaches from numbers. What else could it be? Well, I'm thinking, okay, maybe you don't know very much about the metaphysics of headaches, maybe you don't know very much about the metaphysics of numbers, but you've got enough beliefs about what kinds of things headaches are metaphysically, and numbers are metaphysically, that already implies that you can't get numbers from headaches. So maybe, for example, numbers are abstract objects, and headaches are some kind of like concrete particulars. And maybe there's some principle like you can't get concrete things from abstract things that's just a priori. But then that would fit the format that I'm talking about, where it's knowledge of metaphysics and incompatibilities that's giving you the explanatory gap intuition, not merely lack of derivability. Makes sense.
Well, I guess I don't want to stick too much on derivability. It's just a matter of, it's just a matter of not seeing how this ontology gets you to here, right? Like you can, the physicalist, everybody has to have some story about what it means for the ontology we embrace to explain that. So whatever that story is, I guess that I feel like the problem is that as soon as you acknowledge that there's things like headaches, it's very difficult for me to see how the physicalist ontology gets that same explanatory relation to that as
I see. So
to the boiling of water, say, or whatever. You know, however explanation works, it looks like I'm not getting the same sort of thing here. And maybe it's not physical, maybe I don't have to be non-physical or whatever, but there's something puzzling about it to me. And I don't know how much of a metaphysical belief I need. I just need to know that basically it feels like something, you know, if there's a feeling there.
But from within your own materialist perspective, not trying to argue with dualists or anything.
Yeah.
Would you accept? Would you feel like the explanatory worry has gone away if you have a complete explanation of where all those intuitions come from, and a story about how all your phenomenal concepts just apply to purely material events and so on? Like if you had all that in place, would you still be like, oh, but this? Would you still want to say there's this unresolved explanatory problem that we haven't touched? I mean,
it depends on how that goes, right? If that actually requires me to give out that this feels like something, then at some level, I'm going to say, yeah, that. I mean, if the explanatory sort of goes, oh, this shows you're crazy, right? And everybody just goes crazy once they start thinking about qualities. I'm going to think, no, that doesn't sound like a very good. I'm going to buy the idea that basically I feel something.
Yeah.
Before I buy that I'm crazy, right? And so it seems like. I don't know. There's going to be the details of what that debunker. I mean,
it depends what you mean by this. Yeah. So I mean, hopefully you would agree with this because you're a materialist. This feels like something can be given a slightly deflated, materialist-friendly read, where that's just basically saying, "Yeah, I'm having an experience," and that's a real thing. It's a brain event of a certain kind. And there's a reason why having brain events of that kind lead us to have intuitions that we feel a certain way, and not saying that they're illusory, that they really do refer to these brain events.
Okay, so
Once all that, seems like to me, once all that's in place, it's like hard to see that there's any genuine explanatory problem there. Maybe there's intuitions that there's an explanatory problem, but just tell me what the actual compelling intellectual worry is I'm supposed to have.
okay, one more question.
I wonder, think of vitalism, this idea that life comes from some kind of vital force that is, I don't know, not just mechanical, physical, or something like that. And you would say, well, look, that intuition, how would you handle that one, right? Because you could say, well, maybe, there's this some idea that there's some alien feature that is not just mechanical, it's not just atoms, or something like that, right? But then the way to debunk that is to give a physical explanation of life processes, not just debunk the intuition, right? Does that make any sense, or how do you handle this kind of reasoning?
Well, this is where my taxonomy of debunking arguments comes into play. It depends what kind of debunking we're trying to do. So there's just debunking the truth of vitalism, where we just argue that you can explain how living organisms work in a purely material way. But then there's also addressing someone who doesn't believe in any of that stuff and is still a committed vitalist. And then we want to ask them, where do your vitalist beliefs come from? So it's tell me from within your vitalist worldview how it is that your beliefs about vitalism are tracking the truth of vitalism. That's a different debunking challenge. And maybe they can tell a perfectly intelligible story. I don't know if someone like Aristotle has a good story about how the living form is different from the form of an immaterial thing, and how the living form is imprinting itself on our minds or something, or whatever. Then maybe they could tell some story about it, of that form that would respond to that that other kind of debunking challenge.
But isn't it the case that in the case of the dualism, people just feel that there's a big asymmetry that we are still lacking, or right? That kind of other explanation. So it's not just an intuition. It's maybe you could have intuition about life too, right? But we don't need to debunk the intuition because we already have a kind of working theory.
Actually, I think that in the case of life, the fact that for the longest time people have this intuition that life force was a basic part of the universe, I think that deserves some explanation. I think we don't have a psychological explanation for why all that time people already had that compelling idea. I think we are missing something. Not that we need that to sort of be convinced that vitalism is false, but it still is an interesting explanatory problem that we want to address.
Right now.
Is there any brief question this time? There is time for one brief question. We are done.
Penny with penny.
Thank you.